mind likes to look at hard edges, not soft edges. Now this creates a really big problem, which is the human face. And you're trying to put emphasis on the human face because it's the subject. How the hell are you supposed to do that when softness is less visually appealing than harshness and texture? All right, so the painting that I mainly chose to break down today is a Virgin, which is what it's called, or the Virgin. And this painting is one of those paintings. Now, it's very, very few and far between paintings that I can actually do this for me or for other people in general, where it just stops you in your tracks. Because music, I think, as we can all kind of understand, is probably more evidently powerful than painting. And a lot of time, music can really catch you in your tracks, and it can give you that transcendent moment. But painting doesn't do that very often, and it's really, really a beautiful thing when it can, and that's really what people should be aiming at. This painting really did that for me, because I saw this painting, and it was just like, wow, and it was a moment of inspiration. It was a moment of just awe, and this painting is just so, so beautiful, and it really exemplifies a lot of what great art can be, and what a masterful touch looks like in a different sort of style that we don't usually see. So the major thing that I want to really go on first is the overall composition. All right, so if you look at the major value masses, which is the first thing you should look at for any sort of composition, and we make a little study of this, what's really happening here is that you have this really large upside down triangle at the top, and then we also have two shapes going on right here, and then a general lower shape like this, right? And you can see already from looking at this, your eye is sort of drawn to this area, right? And I'm not trying to make a representation at all. This is actually just the overall value shapes. But what's really striking about this composition is the leading lines, especially lines which obviously relate to the value masses, because value masses are just shapes, and shapes have lines to make them a shape. But you have this giant X that happens, right? Where you see this one line come down here, and obviously it's not a line, it's a curve, but our mind really reads things very simply at a first glance, and that's really what's driving all the power. So you have this line going in right here, and then you have this arm coming in right here, and then you have this line coming in right here, and then you have this arm bringing in all that energy. And because of that, you get this meeting point of intersection. So if you look at abstractly what happens, because painting a lot of the time is just using abstract principles that work and then overlaying them with representational aspects, and then it can tell us, interesting things about the narrative of that story. But anyways, so you have this and that. You're probably going to look at the intersection, especially if the intersection is missing, right? If I go like this, you're going to look at that intersection point naturally. And that's just because our mind likes to follow lines. Because if I go like this, your mind is going to actually feel that sort of rhythm and gesture of the line. It's going to follow it all the way through. And because of that, artists use these value mass lines to bring attention to the subject. And a lot of the time, we need to actually break down what art technically is. And obviously defining it's going to be pretty contentious, but I think we can all agree that a major aspect of it is communication. And when you're trying to communicate something in painting, you can use a lot of different tools at your disposal. And one of them is the lines, one of them is the value masses. You can use texture, all this other sort of stuff. And a lot of the time, if it's not actually, almost all the time, if it doesn't work on a really small scale, it's definitely not going to work big. So if you can break down your composition like this, and you can really explain to yourself consciously or subconsciously that it has a really good effect, and it has a good design overall to bring your eye to the point and subject, you can go forward with the rest of the painting. And I think Abbot Thayer, and this is why a lot of the time in classical teaching you're taught to do these little thumbnail sketches, is that in a thumbnail you can really see if something's working very well or not. You'll see, especially in the Renaissance period and stuff like that, people were just obsessed with the triangular composition. And you can see that really strongly in this painting, right? But it's not just a simple triangular composition. It also involves this upper triangle. And because of that, it adds a little bit of sophistication to it. Because if it's just another boring triangular composition, our eye is really good at picking up on abstract patterns, especially subconsciously. So once you've seen enough paintings that do that and kind of do it, it gets a little bit gimmicky, but it's pretty interesting that he adds on these extra lines, and then it really strengthens that sense of importance, right? And what's also really interesting is that you have this tiny triangle right here from the value masses of the hand up to the face, but then you also have another triangle that's created between the two main value masses of the children's faces, and that creates a second triangle. And then on top of that, you also have this triangle that's going up here. A lot of time when people do these composition breakdowns, it just seems like a bunch of gibberish and BS, right? They're just drawing a bunch of lines over it. No, here's the golden ratio, whatever. But this is actually what you're seeing. This is why the composition works so well, is because it has these triangles in it. So it's not just BS. I mean, if you made a little thumbnail sketch, and this is how you can see if you're just over intellectualizing everything. If you do a little thumbnail sketch and you have that triangle, and then you create a smaller triangle, and then you create this, and then at the intersection of all these triangles, you create a really large value mass, and then you lower down the value of everything, which is essentially what he does. You'll actually see that this creates a similar sort of emotional effect, right? Now, it's not the same sort of representational understanding you get, but if you really just look at it and just look at it with your heart, so to say, I know that sounds weird, but you look at it with your heart, and you can kind of feel it. You can feel a similar sort of thing going on here, right? Now, it's not going to be exactly the same because there's obviously a ton of information that you're taking out. But if it works on this sort of small sketch level, it's going to work in the overall composition. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about besides the overall thumbnail composition is his use of textures. And Abbot Thayer was really good with textures. He's a very weird guy, very eccentric, and he was pretty unorthodox. And it's not to say that unorthodox is necessarily good by itself. You don't want to just be unorthodox for the sake of being unorthodox. Otherwise, you're just a con artist. It doesn't make any sense. But he was unorthodox in a way that actually worked well, and that's really how you determine if something is important or is good in a new sense, right? And what he would do is that he was known for even rubbing grass and dirt into his paintings, right? So this guy was very experimental, but he was really obsessed with different textures and stuff, probably spanning from his early childhood where he was really obsessed with nature and stuff. And bird watching. He said he was bird crazy. Part of the reason why he did a lot of angelic paintings, even though they're seen as more religious, it was more of a obsession with nature and birds especially. But if you look at this painting, one of the most beautiful parts of it is this sense of texture. And that's because a lot of these materials that you see have a sort of local texture, so to say. Now, nobody really uses that word. They'll use local value as a word. And if you don't know what local value is, it's basically like, let's say you have a t-shirt. If you have a white t-shirt, the local value is going to be white. But you could also have, a t-shirt which local value would be gray. Now, if you take both of these t-shirts and you put them in different lighting situations, they're going to act a little bit differently. Now, you'll see the exact same thing with local textures. And this is something that almost nobody I've seen talk about. But it's a very common thing that artists use. Certain things have inherent texture and others don't. So if you look at grass, this has a ton of texture. And the texture is just the repetition of a certain detail. What's interesting about that is a weird aspect of edges, which I'll get into. But you'll look at that, almost everything in this composition has a really textural aspect to it. So that includes these bushes, that includes all this grass down here, includes actually the fabric. Because you can find certain fabric that doesn't really have a texture, so to say, right? You would say that it would have a texture, but it wouldn't be textural, but that's kind of splitting hairs. But if you look at something like vinyl, or if somebody wears really like slick leather pants, it's not really gonna have much of a textural feel to it. It's gonna be really smooth and sleek. But with these, you'll see that it has this really textural look to the fabric. It's a very like cottony fabric, and what that does is that it actually creates this sort of roughness and aspect of detail everywhere. So you have all this detail down in the grass. Now, it's obviously not every blade of grass or whatever, but what he did is that he dry brushed a ton, and it creates this feeling of a lot of detail and texture. And what that does is that if you're creating a ton of texture everywhere, inherently, you're going to want to look at the stuff that doesn't have texture. Now, this is my whole point. If you have a ton of stuff which has a lot of texture, then what are you going to look at? The stuff with no texture, right? And that was the brilliant answer that he had to the large design question, which is human faces. And more importantly, skin. Now, the problem is that as a painter, you are a designer. And as a designer, what you're trying to do is that you're trying to curate your painting to give the best emotional effect on somebody, right? And by curating that you're trying to communicate a certain thing. And when you're trying to communicate, you use difference to put forth your point. So what a lot of artists do is that they'll use contrast, for example, which brings a lot of visual attention. If I have something like this, these two compositions, let's say, your eye's probably going to go to this one because it contains more contrast. So use a lot of abstract difference to create a lot of interest into the subject. Now you'll even see that in this painting, for example, where you have the side of the face which is all dark and the right side that's all bright. And what that does, it just creates a more dramatic sort of, and it looks better because it's communicating something more clearly, because the forms are easier to read when they're in darker lighting, right? But you also have this push and pull between, okay, well, I want to change something because it'll be a better abstract design, it'll get a better emotional effect out of somebody. But the problem is that it's not representationally correct. So a lot of people know that texture itself actually gains a lot of visual attention, right? This versus a really smooth sort of value mass, which one's going to gain more attention? This one will, not this one. And the reason for that is when you're creating texture, you create a lot of hard edges, and your mind likes to look at hard edges, not soft edges. Now this creates a really big problem, which is the human face, right? If you have the human face and you're trying to put emphasis on the human face because it's the subject, how the hell are you supposed to do that when softness is less visually appealing than harshness and texture? Well, the answer is to actually reverse the entire composition so that everything is textural, but the face is without texture. Now, technically, would it be better for everything to be smooth and for the subject to be in texture? Yes, because abstractly, when you abstract out texture versus softness, you prefer texture, right? But, you know, there's this push and pull a lot of the time in designing, and you'll say this yourself, between the representational aspect of something, making something look like the thing it is, and also changing the abstraction behind it, which could be the gesture, it could be the values, the textures, for example, to make a better emotional appeal, better design. And a lot of the time you have to compromise because you're not going to get the best, it's not going to be representationally perfect, and at the same time also the best design. So you have to compromise. And what Abbot Thayer did here is that he made a lot of textures everywhere, and then he also made smoothness right in the face. And this is actually a really brilliant solution, because this is actually similar to a lot of the time you'll see compositions where everything's dark, for example, and then you'll have one light spot. So you might abstract out the composition to look more like this, right? And this might be more visually appealing than this, right? This actually is going to be more attractive to the eye than that, because when you have two extremes in a dichotomy in art, that could be light versus dark, that could be texture versus smoothness, that could be soft versus hard, right? All these other things. One of them is inherently going to be more visually interesting to look at, and then you save those generally for the subject, and then you save the stuff that's not interesting to look at for the surroundings periphery to give a sort of visual importance to the subject. But you have to compromise sometimes. So you'll see a lot of paintings, for example, the Last Communion or whatever, that'll actually use black as the subject. Now, it doesn't give as much of a visual punch, but it still works pretty well. And that's what he's doing here, where you're not going to, if you make everything smooth and then the face full of texture, it's going to look horrid. Now, is it technically a better abstract design? Yes, right? But the faces are very, very smooth. So you're actually not communicating what you're trying to communicate properly, because art is communication. When it's communicated properly and well, it's more visually appealing. That's generally how it works. When you miscommunicate it and then you make the face super textural and stuff, it just doesn't look good. It looks horrible. Now, another thing that we need to look at, which is extremely important, is the edges, right? And when you're looking at the edges on this, it's just insane the amount of edge work that he did in a really sophisticated manner again. So just like we were talking about, where you have the use of difference to create a visual importance and sort of hierarchy within the image, you have edges, which you'll see that soft edges are less visually appealing and harder edges are more visually appealing, or at least more visually evocative. You're going to look at them harder, right? And that's mainly because the reason why we have evolved to do that is because generally when we see things, the center of our vision has really sharp edges and the periphery has soft edges. So when we're looking directly at something that has an inherent soft edge, it almost looks like we're not looking at it, which is weird to think about, but that's really sort of the reason why it works that way, right? But we can kind of hijack that biological system as artists, and then we can subconsciously communicate information which the subconscious is happy to take in. And that's kind of the whole thing that art is, right? But when you look at somebody like this, his edge work is really interesting because, yes, you use those hard edges. Like this, for example, is going to be much more evocative than that, right? And you might say, oh, well, Chad, you changed the value. That changes everything, right? The contrast of this is really what's making it look more, making you look at it more and capture more attention. Okay, well, yes. The answer is yes, that's actually what's happening. But what's weird is that our brain, for whatever reason, actually regards contrast with sharpness. Now, I know that's kind of hard to wrap your head around, right? But if you have a square like this, right, you can have, let's say we take soften all this edge, right? Just soften it a ton. Okay, now it's really soft, but it's still quite dark. Okay, this versus that from far away, you're going to look at this one more, right? Now, what's weird about that is that this actually reads as harder from far away. It looks harder, right? This looks softer just because the value difference is there. So what you can do is that you can actually mimic a soft edge without it actually being a soft edge. And when you look at this face, what's brilliant is that if you have a really light background, like what he has here, and then a really dark foreground, which is this woman's hair, what it creates is this really hard edge, right? Now, is it actually hard? You go in there and not really, actually, because hair shouldn't be hard. But you go in there and it looks really hard from far away, even though it's soft. Versus something like this, which is just as hard. The actual edge between the background and the foreground is just as hard. But you don't read it as such. If we darkened it up like this and the edge actually doesn't change, then instantly you get more attention towards this shoulder, right? So when you're working, you're going to have to think about a lot of different things, a lot of moving parts, with edges especially. Because on the one hand, you have to think, okay, is this representationally correct, right? Is what the edge that I'm using actually describing the form properly? Which for clouds and stuff like that, generally, the edges are super soft, right? But if let's say your subject is the cloud, then you might want to create more contrast behind the cloud and then soften up the edge. And what that does is that you're being more representationally correct while also getting the benefit of that hard edge to communicate that importance. And if we look at what Abbot Thayer is doing here, he's using this hard edge every single time. Look, hard, 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 even though it's not actually hard. And what that does is that the three most important things in the painting are the ones right next to the contrast spots. And what's brilliant about that is you can be true to all the edges, or true to all the values and all the edges, in the sense that a lot of this hair is soft and a lot of the edges of the faces are correct and stuff, but you can use that contrast. So you can kind of get a hard edge without actually having to use a hard edge. And that's something really brilliant that he did. Now, the other thing that you want to think about is that in your paintings, just like Abbot Thayer did, in your backgrounds, you're not going to want a lot of really hard edges, right? So you can see here, the clouds actually melt kind of into the foreground. And you don't really see that at first, but you really look at it and it looks pretty strange, right? Like, shouldn't you see a stopping right here? And I mean, the answer to that is, this is one of those situations where this probably isn't representationally correct, but for all intents and purposes, the design is better. Because when you have soft edges in the background, it looks more representationally correct. Now, why is that? Okay, well, what in vision, just like we were talking about, just like how things are closer to us, they look darker because there's less particles of air between us and the subject, versus things that are far away are going to look lighter, like mountains and those sort of things, because of something called atmospheric perspective, right? But just how we just found out, right, the things that have less contrast look softer. You can sort of make it double as soft by using really similar values and a soft edge. And when you use really similar values and a soft edge, it looks really soft. So a sort of value arrangement like this one that you see here, where it's kind of a lost edge. You can't really tell exactly where it is. But do you see how this shape is a little bit darker than that shape? when you look at that, you could have actually sharpened it up a lot, and you would have still gotten a similar sort of effect. But it doesn't give as much of a... It already draws my attention. I can already see more attention right here. My eye is already drawn more like this. But now that the values are similar, probably representationally, you can just soften up that edge and it looks correct, because they're so similar anyways that your mind peripherally would actually read them as soft. So in the background, you can soften edges more than they look in reality and get away with it, especially if the contrast really similar. But in the foreground, if you try to do that, it would look very wrong. You wouldn't want to soften up all the edges. Now, the other thing that's really interesting about Abbot Thayer is that just like Michelangelo and other artists, well, back in the day especially, they were mostly drawers first and foremost. So in drawing, you have a lot of focus on the outline. And that's mostly because you're not putting in backgrounds in a lot of drawings. In a lot of drawings, it's kind of just the focus, and then the background's white. So to delineate between the edge of something, you put an actual line there. But Abbot Thayer actually did this in his paintings, which is interesting. Michelangelo, again, did the same sort of thing. But in his, it's always a kind of bizarre look. If you look at a lot of his paintings, a lot of them have this creepy sort of feeling to it, and that's because a lot of the shapes are wrong in an unsettling way, but in an interesting way. But he also does this interesting thing where he actually outlines the subject. And I always found that interesting because obviously, you know, this line doesn't exist. Like, that's not there in real life, right? But he does it anyway. He does the same thing with the hand here. Now, a lot of the time you can get a little bit of a shadow shape below the wrist here, but here you can see that he's actually outlining that more than you would see in reality. That's an artistic choice. It really was a particular thing that he did. You can see again this outline thing. But what you can do with this is that, just like we were talking about with that extra contrast and how that creates a lot more visual interest, you can use that to heighten what the subject is. So he probably didn't put it in here because it would have looked representationally too wrong, but he could have chosen to actually add in a bit of an outline here, and that would have even strengthened the seeming unconscious like visual importance of the subject had he done that, right? So you're already looking at it a little bit more. But just that dark line, even though it could actually be quite soft, it gives that sense of sharpness and that sense of importance, right? Even if you darken it a lot, that still looks more important. Your eye goes there even more now. Now, it's subtle, of course, but a lot of great things in art come out of subtlety. All of these fundamentals are really intertwined in very weird ways, and to get really competent at using them, you have to know how to use them first and foremost, but then also understand a lot of the intricacies of how they relate to one another and how pushing one pulls the other and this sort of thing. And really, when you're becoming an artist, you're not just doing what you feel like doing. You're kind of a detective, right? What you're doing is that you're coming towards a painting like this, and then you feel the emotional effect that you get from it. And then you think to yourself, okay, well, why am I getting that emotional effect? And then you say to yourself, okay, well, there can only be so many things in art, just like how in music or whatever you have 12 notes. You have a limited, basically, palette of stuff to work with. And in visual art, you only have colors, edges, shapes, etc., textures. And you only have a limited number of stuff that could be the cause of the emotion that you're feeling from the piece. So you take one of these pieces and you really break it down, right? And once you technically understand all the fundamentals, you can really unlock a lot of the power that art has. And then on top of that, you're actually becoming a bit of a psychologist in a weird way, because art exists on a psychological plane. It's not something that exists, so to say, without human beings. The sense of an objective quality of art would almost cease to exist, because it's a psychological phenomena. So when you're doing a lot of art analysis, why does this painting work and this painting not work? You're actually learning how people perceive things, why they perceive things, all this sort of stuff. And you look at a great painting like this, and you can understand all the technical stuff, like all the stuff that I just broke down here. But at the end of the day, the reason why you're getting into it is for that emotional experience. And you can, you really get in and you get all technical and in your face and in your head and all about all this stuff. But then sometimes you can just sit back and look at it, and you're reminded of why you got into it in the first place. And that's really what this painting does for me. It's an absolutely gorgeous painting, a great artist. And I just hope all of us can one day reach a level like this, because this is, at least to me, what true art should aim to achieve. But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this breakdown.